Ottawa County has been busy at work with our own cultural intelligence initiative for the past couple of years. I've been invited to sit in with Jim Brooks. He had a group of CEOs. I represented government, and we also participated in the CEO Advisory Council. And what I learned from these talks with mostly private sector, but some public sector and also nonprofit large institutional leaders is that very, very much so they're looking at the ability to attract global talent as the lifeblood to their future. It gives them the very ability to compete in the new global marketplace. And also, I'd noted a good deal of concern over whether or not we would be able to attract that talent, and also even some conversation about way off in the future, maybe even needing to move some things to other places of the country in order to be able to attract that talent. And as I thought about it, Ottawa County has enjoyed an unparalleled reputation as a place where people want to come to live, work, and play. In fact, if you look, we were the only county in Michigan to grow at double digits or more for 4 decades in a row. And then when the last census came out, we're the only county in the state to grow at a rate of double percentage for 5 decades or more. And since 2010, if you saw the Holland Sentinel yesterday, we led Michigan once again in population growth. However, I see that as at risk, and as I love Ottawa County, my family came here in the 1850s. I moved back to Ottawa County to become the administrator 11 years ago, and as we talked this over with our Board of Commissioners, they also saw the importance of this, so we began our own cultural intelligence initiative, and we decided to work with LEDA to train all 1,200 of our employees to understand what white privilege is, what are some of the issues of the day. And you might say, well, why bother? I mean, you're not hiring people globally. Your lifeblood isn't really whether or not people come here from Italy or other places of the world to take jobs. So I suppose we could sit on the sidelines. One of the quotes that's always kind of driven me is Marcus Aurelius, who built Roman aqueducts, and he said, saying a thing and doing a thing are two completely different things. So we can either sit on the sidelines and see whether it plays out or not, or how it plays out, or we can take an active role. So our thinking is this. We have 1,200 leaders who work for Ottawa County. They're leaders in their families, they're leaders in their communities. They go to church, they shop in the store, they go to health clubs, they walk the street, play in the parks, and they all have their circles of influence. So if our leaders are all armed with the appropriate information of what's happening in the world, then they can have an impact in those areas. And if all organizations took that on, if individuals and different organizations took that on, my visual is concentric circles where they grow with knowledge and with a better tolerance and acceptability and love for each other. And ultimately then we can become that community of the future where anybody will feel welcome to come here to take any kind of job. And so as I reflect on this, I think once again I'll paraphrase a quote of Theodore Roosevelt to say this county or West Michigan or Michigan won't be a great place for anyone to live unless it's a great place for everyone to live. With that, it's my honor to be able to introduce to you Reverend Alvin Herring, who did a fantastic job here last year. I'm sure anyone who was here last year won't forget the Reverend. But he is the Director of Training for the PICO National Network, an assembly of faith-based community organizations working to create innovative solutions to problems facing urban, suburban, and rural communities. Reverend Herring has over 20 years of experience as a trainer and consultant in the areas of leadership development, community building, and community organizing, social justice activism, personal empowerment, and strategic planning. He's the former Chief Operating Officer of the National Coalition Building Institute and former Executive Director of the Working Interfaith Network in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He has also served as lead organizer for PICO in Richmond, California, and Contra Costa County. Please join me in giving a warm West Michigan welcome to Reverend Alvin Herring.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you might imagine, it's quite a challenge to be the last speaker of the day on a Friday, right? So But I'm really privileged to be here. It is really my honor. We were here last year, not actually in this location. Last year, I think we were at Hope College, and spring had already sprung. It was warm, and the tulips were blooming. And today it's cold, and there's still snow on the ground. So I told this really corny joke to my breakout session. I'll say it to you. So I'm bringing you greetings from the lower 48. Yeah. You didn't think it was funny either, did you? Okay. But it really is a privilege to be here. But before I get into my presentation, I'm an old school preacher. I won't preach at you too much. But, kind of in the old school, they always tell you and instruct you to give thanks for the people that have impacted you in some way. And in this regard, I want to give thanks to Gail and the Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance. Give thanks to her for her leadership, I think visionary leadership. And I solicit your applause for Gail and the Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance. And that's well deserved, but seldom do we actually ever lift up the names of the other people who are also laboring in this vineyard, co-laboring in this very tough, challenging work. So if you would forgive me for a moment, I'd like to also thank Sarah and Alfredo and Eunice and Claudia and Johanna, Patricia, Diane, and Teresa, and Nancy. They're also staff members with the Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance, and I would solicit your applause for them as well. They're probably somewhere in the room. They have probably labored really hard to make sure that we could all be here today and this afternoon. Has it been a good conference, a good summit so far? Yeah, it's been outstanding for me. I'm Reverend Alvin Herring. I am since the last time I was with you, I got a big promotion. I'm now the Deputy Director of the PICO National Network, and it's PICO, although we have a funny name. We're going to change it, but because people don't always know how to pronounce it, but it's PICO. And PICO is the nation's largest and oldest community organizing, faith-based community organizing network. We have organizing agencies in 19 states, 12 kind of big regions across the country, 151 U.S. cities, about 3,500 congregations of all religious backgrounds and denominations. Every day, about 1 million Americans organize their faith voice and their faith muscle through PICO. And recently, we've begun to do work in Central and South America and in Rwanda in Africa. In the summer, we'll be going to Haiti and teaching the skills of community organizing, but from a faith place. In our country, we have a fairly bright line separation between that which is of faith and that which is secular. And so I don't personally find that useful, but it is the way things are done. And so it's always a challenge, I think, for you, probably a challenge for me, but probably a challenge for you to have a preacher talk at you and talk with you and share time with you around this issue, for fear that I'm going to only be able to parse the ideas and concepts around moving beyond bias through a faith lens, and I'm going to use a whole lot of faith language, and there's going to be a lot of these and thous, and then there's going to be a lot of shouting and singing, and then we'll pass the basket, and I'll leave here with a pocket full of money. But that is not what we're going to do, all right? We are not doing that, all right? I've been working on this issue of race, it seems, my entire life. I'm not ashamed. Actually, I'm rather proud to say I'm 57 years old. Born in 1957, which is kind of cool. I was raised in the segregated west side of Louisville, Kentucky, during the Jim Crow era in the South. And some of you may know that era from your own personal historical experience. Some of you may have read about it in school. Some of you may have heard about it on TV, or you saw the movie Selma, and now you know. You too marched with Dr. King. But in 1964, my mother, who was from Indiana, and my father, bless you, who was from Kentucky. That's the pastor, I'm sorry. I have a handkerchief too if you really need it. My father, who was from South Alabama, Clayton, Alabama. You may not think you know Clayton, Alabama, but if you have ever heard of Governor Wallace, he was from the same town my father was from. Well, my mother and father, we were living in Louisville, and my father wanted to take his young family home to meet his family in Kentucky. This was 1964. I was 7 years old. And we were all excited. But my parents woke us up in the middle of the night, packed us out to the car in our pajamas, and we headed on our way to Clayton, Alabama. And my father drove really fast, now I understand, wanting to make the trip, greatest amount of daylight that he could make it in. My mother fixed a big meal, and I was happy because she's a great cook, but a little sad because I thought we'd get to stop along the way. And on one occasion, where we needed gas, we stopped at a filling station. That's what we called them back then. I'm really dating myself, but I see some of you all with a little gray hair know what I'm saying. We stopped at a filling station, and we asked my mother, could we go in to use the bathroom? And she said, no, and I didn't understand what that meant. But she took us out into this field, and she put her dress around us, and she said we'd have to go to the bathroom there. And that's what we did. And we were hungry, and we saw all the signs for restaurants, but we couldn't stop at a restaurant. We had to eat the food that Mama fixed, and that was good. But the trip was really confusing. And then we got to Clayton, and I was so happy. I saw lots of cousins I had never seen before, aunts and uncles, and I had never been to the South. I had never seen peanuts growing out of the ground, or cotton for that matter, and big old hogs. And I'd never seen an outhouse before. Pray to God I'd never see one again. But my Uncle Clayton, that was his name. Clayton lives in Clayton. My Uncle Clayton, they didn't have running water, so my mama wanted to wash our clothes. And they had a wash tub and a washboard, and an old machine on the back porch. They called it a mangler. You put your clothes in there and you wound it up, and you turned it and you cranked it and it dried your clothes. And my mother, being from the north, said, we're not doing that. And so she made my father take her into town to the laundromat, and there were two laundromats, and one said colored. And well, that was exciting. I'd never heard of a colored laundromat. And I thought, wow, it's going to be pretty in there. And my mother poked her head in the laundromat, and she said, no, I will not wash my children's clothes here. And my father dropped us off, and she marched us up the street, my brother and sister and I, to the whites-only laundromat. And she proceeded to put our clothes in, and her detergent. And it wasn't too long before a young white woman, much younger than my mother, came and confronted my mother in a very angry tone and used some language that I had never heard used with my mother before. My mother is 95 years old. She's still alive. Amen. Thank you, Lord. And my mother was, besides my father, the most powerful person I had ever met. To this day, I say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, to my mother. She demands and commands respect. And my mother didn't take anything from anybody, but she took every word that young woman said. And that young woman grabbed our laundry and threw it out on the sidewalk. The sheriff was called. The sheriff came. A crowd assembled, and they were hurling racial epithets at my mother. And my mother was given as good as she was getting. I remember that. Strong and defiant and protecting her 3 children, she made us get behind her. And I'm a child, so I cried. And I don't know if you remember, but you know, when you're little, when you get scared, you gotta pee. And I did. I had never been so scared in my life. And my father eventually came, and we went back home. And my father was angry at my mother for taking us into that place and risking our lives. And my mother didn't want to talk about it, and she never talked about it again until she turned 70. And she said, I figure I better tell you all about that incident before I get too old to remember it. And I'm going to tell it to you one time. Because our question was, why did you do that, Mama? And she said, I was watching what was going on. I was watching Dr. King and all the other civil rights leaders, and I was seeing the country maybe had a chance to change. And she said, you know, she said, I looked at myself, and she said, here I'm a black woman without even a high school education, you know, laboring with 3 small children. And she said, you know, she had learned from a very early age that her life wasn't really going to be about much. But she said something got into her that day. And she just decided that whatever she had been hearing and been listening to, she was not going to listen to that day. And decided that she could do something, even if it was small. I tell that story as often as I can. One, because I love and want to salute my mother and all of her name is Ruth, and all the Ruths from that era and other eras who figured out what you and I are being challenged to figure out right now in our own lives. And that is how to interpret a world in such trouble, in a country so torn by racial division and racial strife and inequality and lack of opportunity. How to take that on in our own lives, in our own souls, if you will, in our own families, in our own communities in this state, and decide that we may not be able to change everything, but we are being called and have an obligation to change something. And that the work of being alive right now is the work of finding your moral center and your moral voice, opening up your mouth and let the music of change, the song of change, begin. And that's where I want to take us in the time that I have with you this afternoon. Getting beyond bias. You know, we're talking a lot about bias these days, and for good reason, because we've been talking about racism and white privilege and white supremacy for a very long time in this country, and we haven't gotten nearly as far as we need to get. And it's not that not talking about that creates some kind of comfort, because I think on some level it might. But it's that that's not always the most productive way to move people to respond to the call to act. And it's not even about semantics. It's where you begin to focus your understanding and your analysis. One could make the analysis that we live in such a racially chaotic time where there's rampant oppression, violence, interposition and nullification, as Dr. King warned against, because there's something morally and spiritually deficient in the souls of white people. You could make that claim and you would be wrong. You would be so wrong that you would cast, I think, this present moment and those of us who are alive now and those who are coming after us in such a precarious and difficult place that we might never get our thing together. But you would be wrong because that's not true. And you would be wrong because that would be only looking at what might be going on between you and I interpersonally, but not at all looking at what's going on with systems and institutions and the ways in which we are governed and the ways in which we govern ourselves and the ways in which we create laws and the ways in which we build up and run institutions. That without acknowledging that, working on that, from a place that says we are called to find our moral center and from there create change, if we don't work from that place, we will never get there. And so I assert to you that the work that Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance is doing is actually getting us there, because they're not working from that place, they're working from a better place. So what is that better place? Most of us in here have never heard of Thomas Garrett, right? We've heard of Harriet Tubman, but we've never heard of Thomas Garrett. That's probably because you've never been to Wilmington, Delaware. Because if you go to downtown Wilmington, Delaware, although it's not as pretty as Western Maryland or Western Michigan, I know it is pretty here. But if you go to Wilmington, Delaware, downtown, there's a river, but there's a park, and it's Tubman Garrett Park. Well, we've heard of Harriet Tubman, right? Every February we hear of Harriet Tubman, and we dust her off, and we send her on her march again to freedom, and that's all good, right? She'll be looking for that North Star. God bless her, you know? And I'm grateful she did. I wouldn't be standing here if she hadn't, and you wouldn't be here either probably, right? And we need to celebrate. She was an amazing shero and a courageous person who heard the call to work in ways that were liberating and are still liberating us. But we haven't focused much on Thomas Garrett. Thomas Garrett lived in Wilmington, Delaware. Delaware was a slaveholding state. And Garrett, who was a local businessman, I love the conversation about business in this regard. Garrett used his fortune and his privilege as a white businessman to ferry those folk escaping slavery on to freedom. Now, you've heard of the Underground Railroad? Well, Garrett was a bad white brother. He said, nothing underground here. Y'all in my living room. Y'all stay in my bedroom. Y'all can stay on my front porch. They know who I am and where I am, and I will do everything in my power to protect you. And it is estimated that as many as 3,000 people came through Garrett's house on their way to freedom. Now, they threatened to kill Garrett, you know that. And they threatened to imprison him, and they did, and they fined them. And it was a large fine, like $5,000, which is like, I don't know, like $1 million now, I don't know. And you know what he told them? You know what he told the judge? He says, Judge, I am guilty of everything you accuse me of. I have harbored, I have protected, I've created for Harriet false documentation. I've done everything in my power, spent my entire fortune to work on behalf of the liberation of African people. And he said, Judge, by all rights and accounts, I have broken the law. I deserve to be fined, and you can send me to jail. But I make you a promise. When I get out, I will go right back to doing what I was doing before. And that's what he did. So why is it that we don't talk about Thomas Garrett and celebrate his life and the decision he made to locate his moral center and act out of it on behalf of justice? Because to talk about Thomas Garrett would be to talk in ways that are not supported by a dominant narrative. And the dominant narrative says that whites are somehow not able, too fragile, or disinterested, or don't care about racial equity and justice in this country. Or the dominant narrative says you're too fragile and too weak and too scared and too anxious. Or the dominant narrative says, why talk about race anyhow? Playing the race card only makes it harder for us to get along and not easier. There's 5, 6, 10, 20, 100 different versions of this narrative that says that white people don't have a role to play in the liberation struggle of people of color, and for that matter, the liberation struggle of their own families. And that narrative is not true. History tells us that when whites fight for justice, justice arrives. when whites fight. And when they join the fight of people of color, when they join the fight of those who've been on the battlefield for a while, the battlefield changes. And the things that we thought were impossible become possible. Now you might say, well, Alvin, is this what you're doing? You're going to take it easy on white folks. I came here because I wanted you to really give them hell. And if that's where you are, that's a 100 level course. You can get that class anywhere, right? I'm trying to teach a graduate level course, all right? The truth is that white privilege is both real and an illusion at the same time. I remember Dave Chappelle. Remember Dave Chappelle, the comedian? And they offered him $50 million. He said, I went into a room thinking I was going to sit down with people and we were going to have a reasonable discussion about my career, and they offered me $50 million. But what they told me I had to do it taught me two things. Number one, I'm never going to do that. And number two, I've been thinking all this time I've been dealing with white people, y'all ain't the white people. Those people, they really do believe completely in the hierarchy of human lives. And some lives are more precious and valuable than others. The majority of my dear brothers and sisters in this country and in Michigan, and particularly white brothers and sisters, that is not where you are. I know that's not where you are. But going from where you are to taking action requires some work. And my dear brothers and sisters of color, I see you all sprinkled liberally around the room. I see y'all. I know y'all praying for me, Lord, help him. Don't let him do nothing stupid. Because he's going to leave and I have to deal with this. All right, my brother, get me through. You're right, Alvin. There is another narrative. There's a counter narrative. And this counter narrative says that we are so familiar with how racial injustice operates in this country, so familiar at it, that when we get around to giving ourselves permission to talk candidly and truthfully about racial injustice in this country, we begin to understand that there's a whole robust conversation about accountability and responsibility, a whole robust conversation about asking and giving forgiveness, a whole robust conversation about how to straighten out not only our personal relationships, but how to begin to straighten out systems and structures and institutions. But how do we get to that? Well, let's remind ourselves that bias represents unexamined, unconscious emotions, cognitions, assumptions, fears, anxieties about the other. The other. And I want you to look around the room. Would you look around the room? And I want you to spot the other for me. She or he must be here somewhere. Do you see the other? I'm looking high and low for the other. And I don't see the other. Except when we begin to really focus on race, our biases take us to that place where there are those who stand with us, and then there are those who are the other. Just by show of hands, how many people, when they were raised as a kid, growing up as a kid, you lived in a community where most of the people looked like you? Raise your hand if you did. And I want you to look around the room. I want you to be nosy. Be nosy. Look around the room and see how many hands are up. Let the record show that 99.999% of the hands are up. How many of us went to schools where most of the kids look just like us? Raise your hand. And look around the room again. You're going to be shocked to see that every hand is up. Raise your hand if you have children or grandchildren or children in your care. Raise your hand. That's the majority of people here in the room. And how many of us, our children go to a school where most of the kids look just like them? And still lots of hands are up. I asked the question of the group this morning, how many of us do grocery shopping? Anybody here do grocery shopping? And how many of us grocery shop in stores where people look mostly just like us who are shopping? Absolutely. How many of us go to some place to worship sometime during the week? Raise your hand if that's what you do. And how many of us go to a place of worship where most of the people worshiping look just like us? Well, there's a way in which these biases get perpetuated because we just don't have time and experience with one another. We'd like to claim that we do. And you heard the old adage, some of my best friends are. You ain't got no friends like that. Not really. I want you to think about the last 10 people that were not in your family who came over your house, and I don't mean the FedEx man. Who came through that doorway? And I would bet you that the last 10 people that have come through your doorway are people who look just like you. It's like we're living in a place, the Pope calls this a culture of exclusion. This culture of exclusion then casts some people into the role of other. The othering that we are doing is destructive and corrosive of our spirit and of our communities and of our culture. But how do you get around the othering? This process of othering begins at the very earliest moments of life, where social experiences and social conditioning, particularly about social identities like race and gender and religion, they have tremendous impact on who we say the other is. And these biases become very sophisticated cognitive products because they represent powerful associations. When we see things happening together, we build an association and we say, oh, that's why, or that's who that person is. You read a story about someone who is black who broke into a store, ergo all black people break into stores, all black people are dangerous, right? And we begin to make these associations and they become part of what's happening for us on the inside. Even though on the outside, when we're asked, do you believe this? Do you hold on to these beliefs? Is this a part of your moral construct? We will say no and be telling the truth. But on the inside, we've consumed these narratives and we've had these experiences and we've been taught things and things were said and done and we watched things and didn't fully understand what we were watching. But so these biases are there and they run and they run and they run. Does this make sense? So look around this hall. Look around, would you? And I want you to try to really look at each other. And as you look at each other, I want you to begin to look at each other as though the people whose eyes you're meeting, now y'all are looking at me, now look at each other. Look at each other as though the people whose eyes are meeting yours are offering you an invitation. Don't look at your cell phone, don't look at your little computer, don't look at me, look at each other. This is such a challenge for us. Now, my job is not to scold you, but I want to challenge you that the process of taking the power of these biases begin in the work of no longer regarding someone else as the other. And then we have to multiply that to an institutional level. Does that make sense? So as you're looking at someone, I really want you to crane your neck around and extend your hand to someone behind you or someone in front of you. Tap them on the shoulder. Make a connection with them for a moment. Make it intentional. Be purposeful about it. Be purposeful. Oh, I love this brother right here. Amen, brother. He got up out of his seat to shake this sister's hand. Be purposeful about it. Now, as you're being purposeful, look them in the face if you can. I know it's awkward. It feels a little weird. Don't look at me. Look at them. Don't look at me. You've seen me. Look at each other. Now, if you're holding someone's hand, hold it for a moment. Hold it. Hold it. Don't let go of it for a second. It ain't going to kill you. Come on, try it. Hold a hand for a moment. And don't let go. Don't let go. No handshake, no polite. Hold on and don't let go. Hold on like it matters to you. Right? Put as much love in those fingers as you can. Right? I know your hand is sweaty. Mine would be too. Still holding? At our moral center is a radical call to be in relationship to one another. And in relationship, at our moral center is a requirement that everything that we do as human beings, all the products of human culture, our institutions, our laws, our customs, our practices, our policies, all of those are required to begin to be righted in the direction of us holding on to one another. At the center, at our center, is this moral compunction that defies the dominant order and says, I will relate to my neighbor and my brother and my sister as though I am relating to myself. The most radical thing ever said on earth was love thy neighbor and love thy enemy as thyself. So we have to break these associations, and this is not just on an individual level. But we have to find a way to create inside of our communities opportunities for folks to understand and relate to each other differently. So if you look at a community and say that community has poor schools, right? And those kids are dangerous and poorly educated, and they happen to be children of color or poor white kids. We have to begin to break that association and say there's a need for justice over there. And there's a need for maybe me to be so morally outraged by what I'm seeing and connecting to my moral center, to be engaging with people over there. We have got to stop the practice of othering on an individual, institutional, even on a community level. You've got to break it. And you have to wrestle with it inside your own spirit. So yeah, when I'm in an elevator, and there's a white lady in the elevator and it's late and I get on, I know what's going to happen. I mean, you know, I'm telling the truth. And she's gonna clutch and move. That's the move. I call it clutch and move. Clutch and move. And then I am trying to be safe. And so I'll say, oh, wonderful evening, isn't it? Or something stupid like, great elevator, huh? It's a totally incompetent exchange. She's scared and I'm pissed off, right? But these associations can be broken. I'm going to show you how. Our biases are often incongruent with our stated beliefs and attitudes, and our biases are performative, so that which exists on the inside can come on the outside. I don't think that's said enough as we look at implicit bias. We begin to act these biases out, right? You know, Rachel talked about the way in which we're learning to understand how to train and develop police officers around this notion of implicit bias and the acting out of these biases in the way in which they conduct their business in the streets and in our communities. Teachers the same way, healthcare professionals, all of us are struggling with what to do with this stuff that exists and kind of runs on its own power and energy on the inside and totally disconnected from maybe the way we feel in our stated beliefs, but performative. We're acting on them in real time. In religious context or in spiritual context, you know, there's this notion of the scapegoat. A goat sent into the wilderness after the Jewish chief priest had symbolically laid the sins of the people upon it. And what we're seeing in a culture of exclusion is that the other becomes the scapegoat. And we load all of our own deficiencies on that person's back. And who could stand under that? No wonder there's a dominant narrative that says Latinos are lazy or only here to take our jobs, or multiply so quickly beyond their means to support their children. Because those are some of the ways in which we are broken on the inside. When we make these dear people wear that, who could really wear that? And you see the sign that says a man was lynched yesterday. Every 28 hours in this country, an unarmed person of color is shot by the police. Now, you might think that I'm exaggerating. Do your homework. You'll see that there's some truth to that. What are our sins that we have laid on the backs of the other? What are we asking them to carry that we're refusing to carry ourselves? Turn to your neighbor, would you? Ask your neighbor that question. What are we asking the other to carry? Why are we othering? What are we asking the other to carry that we're refusing to carry ourselves? Go ahead, turn to your neighbor. Ask them. What are we asking them to carry? Can someone just yell something out? What are we asking the other to carry? Our responsibilities, our guilt, our fear. What are we asking them to carry? My dear brother, our isolation from one another, our insecurities. We're asking them to carry our mistrust, our distrust, our lack of accountability. Yes? Our anger, our fear. Our failures. So if we understand that, and that's important, How do we begin to incorporate that understanding in making change? And I've got to hustle if I'm going to bring that point across. I submit to you the one way to do it is by investing in this Zulu greeting. I don't know if y'all know who that is. Anybody know who these two people are? See, y'all ain't young, like me. So that's J. Cole, one of the coldest rappers out there. And I love J. Cole. And that's my boy, Dale Earnhardt Jr. Who's a NASCAR driver. I'm from the South. I love racing. And J. Cole was rapping. He had this song, and he was just lifting up people, right? Just lifting up people. And he talked about, and my friend Dale Earnhardt Jr. They had never met each other. But he just kind of appreciated Dale Earnhardt Jr. You know, he lost his father, and he's been living in his father's shadow, but he's like an amazing racer. And he gave him a shout out on this song, and next thing you know, they're hanging out with each other. And they find out they got so much in common. J. Cole and Dale Earnhardt Jr. And they're beginning to figure out ways in which they can use their fortunes to actually create more opportunity for people to begin to work together and begin to actually do something about joblessness and unemployment and poor schools. But it started with this greeting, Sawubona. Turn to your neighbor and say Sawubona. I had you say that last year, and you said last year, what does that mean, Alvin? It's a Zulu greeting, and what do you think it means? Hello? How are you? You are my friend. That's so sweet. It don't mean that, but that's sweet. It means something so profound for the work that we've got to do in de-othering each other and de-biasing ourselves. Sawubona says, I see you. And I think it's firmly established that one of the most reliable and powerful ways to begin to take the power out of our biases is to begin to get into relationship with one another and to begin to experience one another for real and begin to notice the positive attributes, the positive behaviors, the positive qualities in those who up to this point have existed for us as the other. Does that make sense? Now, you should be excited about that, as excited as I am. Now, this is not all the work, but it's amazing how much of the work actually begins and is located in this space. So remember how I had you hold someone's hand? And you were digging that, right? You was digging that, like, wow, this is actually pretty cool. I'm holding a white lady's hand. All right now. All right? I'm holding a brother's hand. Hey. I can go home and say, yeah, okay, I held a black man's hand today. I don't know if you did, but I held an Asian lady's hand, and it was wonderful. I held a man, I didn't know what race he was. He was brown, and I held his hand. And it was good. So turn to your neighbor and say, Sawubona. Now, this is how much we've oversubscribed to the narrative and to the way in which this culture drives us apart. You said Sawubona like a drive-by shooting. Sawubona and go home, right? That's not what I'm saying here. You didn't even see who you were saying Sawubona. This is what we're up against. Actually do it. Turn to your neighbor, say Sawubona, and stop and visit at least with your eyes. So, just for the sake of time, I'm gonna keep you moving pretty fast, all right? So were you able to do that? And what did you see on the other side? You like what you saw? Yeah? Did you tell them that? No, I don't know. No, I don't do that. Did you like what you saw? Yeah? Imagine if you did that for real, and you allowed yourself to actually step into the experience of the person you said Sawubona to, and understood for a moment what life was like for them. You would probably discover what Langston Hughes said is true about all of us, and that for none of us is life a crystal stairway. But let's unpack Sawubona in the 2 or 3 minutes I have left, because this is really critical to understanding this is more than just a warm feeling and more than just an interpersonal experience. Sawubona, to do it well, means that we have to engage our moral center. And this is It can be religious for people who are religious, but it can also be spiritual and ethical for other folks. But wherever you locate that urge, that reaching for truth, that reaching for equity, that reaching for wherever you locate that in there, you've got to bring that with you in this work. And you've got to make that the center place from which you do the work that you intend to do across race and other lines of division. You have to bring that urge, that moral and ethical and spiritual urge to be right with the people next to you in order for Sawubona to be more than just a greeting. You have to confront the systematized and institutionalized false construct of human hierarchy. Amen, somebody. Amen. They weren't the only professors on this stage. That's professorial right there. And it's so powerful. The false construct of human hierarchy. None of us are better than the others, but none of us are less deserving than the other. But we've got to confront the systematized and structured way in which that plays out. Does that make sense? That we've got to acknowledge our individual and collective accountability. We have to actually hold ourselves accountable. Rachel told you about a community that's actually doing that in Easton, Pennsylvania. What if that was the way in which we operated in Western Michigan? We will take the time and do the work and hold ourselves accountable, not only for what happened and why and how it happened, but more importantly from what we want right now and what we intend for our children in the future. We have to acknowledge our need for intentional, internal, and external work. And then this is the place I really want to challenge you. And this is why Gail's work and the work of this alliance is so important. I believe we have to start from a place of vision and work backwards. We spend all this time talking about why we can't do this. How much time are we actually spending talking about what it looks like when we do this? What do our schools look like when there's equity and fairness and opportunities for all, and everyone gets a good... What does that look like? We ought to be speaking it as though it were. What do our housing patterns in our neighborhoods look like when we are actually there, when we have done the work and we're at the place we wanted to be? We've got to be able to chart a vision for ourselves. The dominant narrative says that is not possible. That you start from the struggle and try to build something out of that, and I get that. But we are possibility people. We start from what we cannot see, though it may be the substance of things hoped for. And move, because we have evidence, even though we cannot see it. And then this last piece. August 9th, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. By that following Saturday, I was in Ferguson, Missouri. What I saw in Ferguson was a community in mourning and grief, a traumatized community in such pain. This is not about the political this and that, was Michael Brown a Boy Scout, was Darren Wilson a racist. The fact is the boy was shot and he was left on the street for 4.5 hours. And when children see that, take the politics out of it. When children see that, come on, you all. We're better than that. When I got there, that's what I saw. That's either an MRAP or a Bearcat, and those are automatic and semi-automatic weapons, and they got live ammo in them, and they are not playing. And I'm an old dog when it comes to protests. I've been in a lot of nonviolent protests. But I've never seen this kind of equipment, war machinery on the streets of this country. Water cannons, sound cannons that were neurologically disruptive, and some research says permanently so. Nerve ordnance, 2 forms of tear gas that are not permitted by the United Nations Convention to be used on civilians. Rubber bullets. Wooden bullets, automatic, semi-automatic weapons, and one of these vehicles had a turret-mounted sniper rifle. Why would you bring that to us? Who are you going to use that on? And I'm there. I didn't read this off the news. I'm there. And I'm seeing these children and these people in wheelchairs and women with their babies. They're in the streets and they're hollering. They saw something that looked morally evil to them. And they were just asking for us to be with them, be patient with them as they try to process the trauma of what happened in their community. And the narrative started running. And before long, I think most Americans forgot that that boy was left in the street for 4.5 hours, and those little babies had to see that. And I led a protest of 500 clergy, and some of us got arrested, so that's me inside of a police van going to jail. And I went to jail because I was praying. They arrested me because I was praying. They said I couldn't pray there, and I was praying for the safety of the officers and for healing in the community. But I went there because I was morally outraged. And this brings me to my last point. If we're going to change Western Michigan, if we're going to be a community that justly deserves to be a community of love, peace, and justice, we're going to have to find our moral center and let ourselves be outraged to say, oh no, not here or never again. This dear woman did. She's your sister. We celebrated her passing 50 years ago on Tuesday. 50 years ago, she saw this. And that's Representative John Lewis as a young man, and he's on the ground, and he's about to receive a blow that's going to fracture his skull. She watched on the news young people trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And she was horrified. She's a white suburban housewife from suburban Detroit. She had 5 children. And she watched the news. And she watched it in the right space that I think all of us need to try to find. And she let herself and her soul be moved, and she became morally outraged. And she said, no, this is not who we are. This is not what we are as a country. And she left that night for Selma. And she worked for the second crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the successful one. And she said to Father Deasy, who was there, I'm glad I'm here, but I have a suspicion that someone might lose their life. And she had a premonition that someone might get killed. And she was right. Although the slide isn't there, the person who got killed was Philo Luzo, the sweet young housewife from Detroit who was so outraged, her soul was so moved that she did something. She did what she could. Though she lost her life, she said, maybe one day what we do here will be remembered, and it might make us a better country. A couple of weeks ago, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And this time it looked like this. And I love the sign this white brother's holding up. It says, you should be here. I'm asserting to you, you should be here. The way in which we begin to challenge our biases and move ourselves and our community to a better place begins with understanding something that the prevailing narrative does not want us to know, and that is that your life matters. Everything about it. You are carefully and wonderfully made, and you matter. If that is true, then what you do and what you say for the sake of justice matters. How do you begin to build communities of love and equity and justice? You put yourself in a seat like you put yourself today. You consume, you listen, you talk, you share, you cry, you laugh. And you bring something so deep to the center of your being that it begins to rewrite or write over parts of your moral code. And then, when outraged, when you've had enough, you act. The postscript to my story about Clayton, Alabama, is my mother is now 95 years old. And in September, we're going to celebrate her 96th birthday. And she told me that the other day, she says, you know, you're looking kind of old, son. Got some gray hair. And she said how grateful she was to live until her children got to be old people. But she said something else. And she said the same vision that she had in 1964, she still has. That the world becomes a better place, that people love to learn to love one another, that people understand that their lives matter and what they do for the sake of justice, no matter how big or how small, moves that arc, bends that arc in the direction of justice. My mother said that in this life, if you show up looking like hope, people will hand you their hopelessness. I submit to you on behalf of Ruth Herring that advice. If you show up looking like hope, show up building communities around hope, show up testifying about laws and policies and institutional decisions, and show up about hope, the things that you're looking at and the things that you're dealing with, they begin to change. It's been a real honor and a privilege to be with you. I want to look in your face one more time to make sure I remember. I get to speak to lots of groups across the country. There is something important about being here in Western Michigan, I think because of the powerful pioneering work being done by this alliance, but also because of you. You're good in your soul. You're good in your center. You want good in the world. You'll have to work for it. A new world is coming. She's coming as fast as she can. God bless you.
If I could ask for just 2 minutes of your time before you dart out of the door, please. Thank you, Reverend Herring. In your packets, you have evaluations, and I would be remiss not to ask you to please complete them. They really do drive our summits. But more importantly, the conversations you've heard today have encouraged you to take action. In this place, in the Tri-Cities, if this is a place that you call home, we have the opportunity for you to meet together. I know it's been a long day. I know it's been a long day. But we have an hour and a half to start building that community and taking action, identifying what are the barriers to inclusion and what are strategies that we as a community want to embark on to make this happen. I'm asking you to please join me. Reverend Herring will be joining us. And let's start this discussion about the action. If you are not from this community, I would ask that you think about what you can do back in your communities to organize. And I would offer to you that we are a resource to you to help you with those strategies if you would like them. And the last thing I have to say is that for those folks who came on a bus from Lansing, bless you for doing that, you are leaving now because the conference does end at 3 for everyone except those of us who live in this community. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. I want to thank the staff of the Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance. I want to say it was such a joy for me not to be the MC for the first time ever and to be able to watch Sarah Salguera, talented, come up here and handle that so that I could enjoy the day. But most of all, I want to thank you, because if you didn't come, this would not be happening. So thank you so much. For those of you from the Tri-Cities, if you'll just stay and we will go together down to the auxiliary gym. Thank you so much.